Hi everyone, welcome back to the second episode of the ThoughtfulLeigh Podcast, where on Fridays kind of just a mission to recap business news that may have been going on. I don't know why I keep forgetting to say this. So this is again post-production Leigh saying this, but this is just an informal chat. This is for educational, informational purposes. This is not a financial advice or recommendation, as I am not a legally licensed financial professional. So sending you back to the podcast. I hope you enjoy. Bye. The view looks weird. It's because I'm looking down on my iPad and my laptop is in front of me. First up on today's agenda that I wanted to talk about is the Fed had their FOMC meeting this past week, and just to kind of clarify what is the FOMC stands for the Federal Open Market Committee, which is a committee within the Fed, so not where they kind of have a meeting and they discuss looking at different variables going on within the economy, and considering that they have two mandates, which is to keep inflation at their target price right now is 2%, and also keeping optimal levels of employment. They kind of look at different things that they can do within their toolkit to reach that mandate of 2% target inflation and optimal levels of employment. This past week, they did decide to lower their target range for the federal funds rate, which is the interest rate at which banks lend to each other overnight, or that the banks can borrow from the Federal Reserve itself overnight, and they lowered the target range by 25 basis points to 3.75 to 4%. They have stated that they do believe that inflation has picked up somewhat compared to earlier levels in the year, and it has remained higher. That was the FOMC meeting recap that I did want to go over. The Fed also released their October Beige Book, and just before we go into the Beige Book and what that is, I wanted to describe kind of a bit more about the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve, for those who do not know, consists of 12 different districts. And as you can see here on my screen, I pulled them up on the Fed's website. So you have Boston is number one, then it's New York, Philly, Cleveland. As you can see here, the Richmond one is looking at West Virginia, and then the two Carolinas. You have the Atlantic Fed, which is looking at Georgia and some of the other southern states. You have St. Louis Fed, Minneapolis Fed, Kansas City, Dallas, and then you have San Francisco. So for the Beige Book, each district will kind of conduct surveys, or they will just have different data points that they're collecting within their own district or region, trying to kind of understand or get a temperature test of what is going on in the economy for that district. And then they kind of also put together, so at the beginning it's a high level kind of summary of all the things that all the districts saw, and then later on there's a more elaborate report from each district. So I kind of just went through the overall summary of what was in it, and I did want to talk about some of the things that they did describe. So the first thing that they described was that consumer spending declined slightly, especially on retail goods, although they did note that some regions saw a pickup in electric vehicle sales due to expiring tax benefits, I guess, in September. And so this is looking at September activity, but was released in October, I believe. So they also said that demand for leisure hospitality services by international travelers further declined, but domestic was unchanged. Now, I thought this was very interesting because it goes back to what we talked about last week and the earnings for LVMH, Hermes, and Kering, where they all kind of said that local demand was strong, but they saw a pullback kind of in tourist spending. And so it's kind of interesting to see even here, that's kind of what was playing out in the U.S. market as well. They also said for spending for higher income individuals remained strong for luxury travel, which again kind of remained similar to, I believe LVMH said it, where they said that luxury or high-end consumers did play into their results. They also said that some districts reported lower and middle income individuals were continuing to seek discounts and promotions to combat rising prices and economic uncertainty. Couponing. We'll play into kind of what we're going to talk about with one of the companies for their earnings today, because they are actually trying to get away from how many discounts they offer. Because, sometimes in retail, they'll offer you a discount code, and I think retail is kind of hard once you train the consumer to believe that you can get discounts off of something. If you try to take that back, they're going to miss the discount. they're going to be like, well, I could have gotten this cheaper before. Why am I paying more for it now? But moving on, we'll talk about that later on during the company's earnings. Further, they noted most districts noted challenging conditions for manufacturing due to higher tariffs and weaker demand. Specifically, they said that tariffs did contribute to higher input costs in many districts. However, the degree to which tariff increase was passed through in terms of price increases to the consumer varied. This is something that we did talk about last week also with Laura Piana's earnings as part of LVMH, as Laura Piana's, which we know is very affluent in general. They noticed that their consumer response, it was receptive. Like they were okay with the price increase. I do think as we get more into these Q3 earnings, seeing how companies are responding to the tariff increases, or I guess in Q4 also, that's when we'll definitely kind of see it, how much of these are going to get passed on the consumer and what companies you will see get pushed back versus others who won't. I'm not sure if it'll just be your lifestyle companies where people, even for the lifestyle, they'll continue to pay for it. Like in terms of, I might not be LVMH's typical consumer, however, I want to look like I'm LVMH's typical consumer. Like, will that person continue to want to shop LVMH or buy from LVMH? That's something that I think they might eat through the cost, especially, or for people who are diehard lovers of I love Apple and all my other products are Apple, so I'm going to keep buying Apple. Or at one point, I guess it'd be interesting to see at what point do people trade off. I think for certain goods that are not as brand heavy, that might not be able to work as well. They also said that some companies kept prices the same in order to keep market share, or they did actually get negative customer feedback on the prices. In terms of specific regions, in Atlanta, they did note a decline in leisure travel. For St. Louis, there was a continuation of noting labor shortages due to immigration policies. Also, they received comments that consumer purchasing power was being minimized due to inflation. What is consumer purchasing power? Because consumer purchasing power is how much can I buy theoretically, $1. You'll see consumer purchasing power in terms of inflation, because they'll compare that let's say today I'm able to buy a bag of bread for $1, but then let's say tomorrow the bag of bread I bought today is now $2. That $1 can only afford half the bag of the bread. So the purchasing power went down. So moving on from there, from Minneapolis, there was a concern about China pulling back from buying soybeans. This is something that is kind of interesting. I never really thought about China buying soybeans from Minneapolis or the Midwestern states. I only really use soybeans for soy milk or tofu. So this will be interesting now that it's on my radar. In Dallas, the top concerns for businesses were slowing demand, policy uncertainty, and inflation. So as we can see here, inflation is something that we're going to have to look up. For demand, it's something else that we're going to have to look up. As you saw in Atlanta and with some of the other ones, travel and travel-related purchases might also be interesting to watch as well. So that was the October 25 Fed Beige Book, our brief summary results that were out there. And now we're going to go into earnings. So I know that the big tech companies, this week, Alphabet, Microsoft, Apple, and Meta all announced their earnings, but I did kind of want to specifically talk about two fashion companies instead. Why, you might ask? Because I kind of thought the big tech earnings were kind of boring. I don't know, I think big tech in general, we get it. The Mag 7 or the Magnificent 7, they are very exciting, AI, they drive the economy now, but I think I've just learned a lot with these other two earnings in general. So the first company that we're going to talk about is SMCP, which is the owner company of Sandra, Maj, and there are two other brands, but I mainly know them for Sandra and Maj. Primary things I wanted to talk about with their earnings specifically, and we talked about this in the Beige Book discussion. They are, you can see right here, they said that they're continuing their strict full price strategy with reduction of discount rates in Q3, especially in China, and for Maj and the other brand in Europe. I'm really curious to see how this will play out for them. Sandro and Maj, they're both contemporary and high street mixed up, and that you'll see them in Bloomingdale's, and then they have their own standalone stores, but you also do kind of see them online a lot. do think that they are like more than upper income spenders. So I don't believe as much that it will impact them, but I'm interested to see what their sales will look like. Sales breakdowns, again, I only know this company mainly because of Sandro and Maj, but it is interesting that Sandro was 50% of their sales, Maj was 38%, the other two brands were 12%. And then in terms of by channel, 89% of the sales were through retail and 11% were through wholesale. And then they did state, going further on, that Maj and Sandro continue to grow and gain market share. And then they had good momentum in Europe and America and China. It does look as though they are working out their network still, but then also specifically, I guess that's where they're trying to enforce more so the discount code. There are the pullbacks from discounts and offering strictly full price. And then moving on, I did want to talk about Adidas, or Adidas, their Q3 results. In general, they say they have great brand momentum in Q3, and then just in general, they had their highest sales quarter in Adidas history. It does seem as though Adidas is definitely the hottest brand, at least for footwear on the streets, it seems, because most of the shoes I see on the streets are Adidas. Here for the revenue growth, they did talk that 10%, wholesale grew by 10%, own retail grew by 13%, e-com grew by 15%. By channel, wholesale makes up 63% of their sales, e-com makes 15%, own retail makes 22%, and then direct-to-consumer makes 37%. Here, I knew Adidas was a footwear brand. Like, I think that's what we all know them for, but we also do know them for, like, their apparel and some other stuff. But this really does show 57% of their sales were for footwear, 36% apparel, and 10% accessories. So footwear grew by 11%. Apparel grew by 16%, and accessories grew by 1%. This Arsenal jersey is really cool, and then the cleats are really cool. Okay, lifestyle grew by 10%. I believe this is for footwear. So it really does seem as though Adidas is going to double down on the Samba, Gazelle, and the Spezia as the classics. Like the Sambas, I think these three in general, these are the shoes that you really are seeing like on the streets, like everywhere you go. And because they just have so many different color variations, so many different methods for them. They're really cool. Like these metallic ones, I really need these. I don't need them, but these are really cool. And then of course you can see here for the low profiles, you do have the taekwondos, which are also really cool. The ballerinas, which of course they had the collab with Bad Bunny on, which also made these really cool. I think for the Sambas, like I know specifically for me, I bought a pair of like pink Sambas because I couldn't get a Bad Bunny collab version of them. So they definitely are taking advantage of the hype in terms of Bad Bunny, but then also just like knowing kind of what's like streetwear kind of making things cool. Now you have these, like they're calling lifestyle football, which I didn't realize were like cleats that aren't cleats for football, because like they don't have the actual metal spikes or the spikes in general, because of course you can't wear metal on turfs, I believe. And just in general, some of these matching sets I felt like have been really interesting lately too. Like again, look at these Sambas with the Croc, their creative director is moving on from them to go on to Hermes Men's Readywear, which is really cool, so congratulations to her. One thing I do want to pull up for them, okay, here we go. I'm actually going to pull up their second quarter presentation and a bit after this, as I realized I thought their third quarter one talked about, but it's their half year or their second quarter one. So in terms of guidance, it does look as though they're offering further clarity on guidance. So for net sales growth, besides Yeezy, they do maintain that they believe they're going to see double-digit growth for the year. For net sales growth, for reported, they're saying around 9% growth, and operating profit of around 2 billion euros. Macroeconomic and geopolitical uncertainty is there. They are anticipating further market share gains despite the market conditions, and they are anticipating continued investment in marketing and sales, and they are anticipating no Yeezy revenues or profits in 2025. For additional considerations, they are anticipating better than expected 9-month 2025. So the first 9 months of 2025 were better than expected. Their attitude towards Adidas brand globally, they're considered to be also positive. So tariffs, they are now thinking for the full year is going to be around 120 million in terms of that's the cost of the impact that they're going to have on them, and indirect tariff impacts on consumer sentiment. So as we talked about, maybe again, this is not them saying that they're going to increase prices, but just in general, the tariffs in some way are going to negatively impact the consumer wanting to spend more or spend in this environment. And then something that they also talking about here, which again, Hermes, LVMH, Kering, and some of the other companies talked about, is negative currency impact. So currency exchange rates are affecting companies at this rate. I do want to see specifically if there's one currency that they talk about too. Like, is this continuing to talk about the yen compared to last year, like how luxury companies were talking about, or is it just the euro versus the dollar in general? So I pulled up Adidas's a half-year presentation, and this is kind of where they just do different charts of the impact of the different U.S. tariffs by country. I know fashion retail companies, they do have countries in which they operate in. I guess just seeing it here, though, how they have 10 different companies that they're looking at is interesting to see. And then they kind of also talk about the share percentage of like U.S. volume is for each company. So like Vietnam and Indonesia are really high. And then they kind of also talk about here as they're kind of trying to shift as many as the remaining U.S. bound products from China to Vietnam or Indonesia, since as we know, when the U.S. tariffs were first announced, China did have a very high tariff percentage rate. Further on in their full year report, interesting to see kind of how the strategy of rerouting products worked for them. So now they're saying that switching the US-based products that were made in China to now Vietnam and Indonesia frees them up for capacities to use that space in China to make China and other non-US market products. As they're doing this, like, this has to be a pretty robust supply chain at this point in terms of tracking which products are going to which country, and they're also reviewing pricing. AKA, again, it'd be interesting to see here what the tariff impacts due to pricing, not just for them, but for a lot of companies. And so yeah, that's kind of the things I wanted to talk about with Adidas today, but just in general, kind of just a brief informal chat about what's going on in the economy, kind of also just some business news as well. So I hope you all have a good weekend, and I look forward to talking to you next week. Bye.